Yeah.
Sorry, I talked during the whole thing. I'm sorry.
No, it's totally fine. So welcome everybody that is here. This is the upcoming publications showcase. So I'm going to share a little bit about our panelists, and then actually, sorry, I'm going to share not my whole screen. There we go. I have my notes on another window that I need. There we go. All right. So our esteemed panelists, unfortunately, John Ira Jennings couldn't be with us, but we have 4 amazing people that are going to share a little bit about their works that are coming out and or just came out. So up first, we have Joel Christian Gill, and he's a cartoonist and historian who speaks nationally on the importance of sharing stories. He wrote the words and drew the pictures in Fast Enough, Bessie Springfield's First Ride, which is published by Lion Forge, and the award-winning graphic novel series Strange Fruit, Uncelebrated Narratives from Black History, as well as Tales of the Talented Tenth from Chicago Review Press. He has worked for diverse clients, including The New Yorker, NBC, The Boston Globe, and has written for The Huffington Post. His latest work is a memoir chronicling how children deal with abuse and trauma. Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence, which is with Oni Press. And he's currently adapting Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, a definitive history of racist ideas in America, into a graphic novel from 10 Speed Press. He is an associate professor of illustration at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Gill has dedicated his life to creating stories to build connections with readers through empathy, compassion, and ultimately humanity. He received his MFA from Boston University and his BA from Roanoke College. This is why I read graphic novels, because I can't read words. So thank you, Joel, for being here. Lilah Sturges is the author of many books. She lives in Austin, Texas with her 2 daughters and 2 cats. Her just released book on the 16th of February, Girl Haven, follows the teens Ash and friends on their adventures in Curatress. I say it differently in my head, so then I get all like flustered when I have to say it out loud.
Fine, it's made up, so there's no way to say it wrong.
There you go. So Curatress is a haven for girls with no men or boys allowed. So thank you, Lilah, for being here. And next up, we have Yehudi Mercado. He is a former pizza delivery driver, and Disney art director living in LA. From award-winning animated short films to co-writing and art directing the Guardians of the Galaxy mobile game, Yehudi has worked in various media for over 15 years. His creator-owned comics include Buffalo Speedway, Pantalones, TX, Rocket Salvage, and Hero Hotel. His upcoming work, Chunky, is a pseudo-memoir of his childhood struggles with his health and an imaginary mascot who cheers him on as he tries out for multiple sports teams. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right. And then last but not least, we have Stanley. And she makes comics that are sometimes creepy, sometimes funny, but always queer. She's been making comics since she was in high school and has continued doing so throughout various science-related careers when she was supposed to be doing science. Instead, she created Friendly Hostility, The Hazard of Love, and her online journal comic Stananigans. I'm sorry. Stananigans.
Perfect.
Her upcoming work, The Hazards of Love, follows a non-binary teen through the land of terrifying, flesh-hungry creatures known as Bright World, and is heavily influenced by the ephemera of Mexico where Stan grew up, though she now finds herself in New York City amongst a loving crew of weirdos, and it is currently snowing there. She lives with her spouse, a large cat, and a large collection of bones, some of which you can see behind her there. So thank you.
Yeah, a little bit. It's the hidden object game decor aesthetic.
That's awesome.
Nice.
So thank you so much everyone for being here, and I appreciate, especially since some of you this is very late as you are on the East Coast, so we'll get right into it. So all day we've been trying to do some different things with our summaries so that they're not just, okay, here's my book and it's nice and all, but let's be creative. So for this one, I'm going to ask you if there was a article in the National Enquirer reporting the plotline of your book, what would the headline be? So, sensationalist headline for your plot. So we'll start with Joel.
Oh God, I was hoping you talked to somebody else. I had a second.
Or
to
does
think
anyone
about
have
it.
one that would just came to their head? Oh,
I do.
Lilah, go ahead.
I actually prepared one, and it's not that good though. It's just, boys not welcome in magical world. Rabbits, okay.
That's fantastic.
Nice.
So that's an important distinction, which I want to know. Do we want salacious National Enquirer, or do we want like Weekly World News? Because the latter is probably more appropriate for my work than the former, but you know, I want to follow the brief.
Whichever you find is better, go ahead.
All right. See, if we go with Weekly World News, then it's cat steals identity, becomes law-abiding student and loving partner. Alternatively, we can go with the National Enquirer, illegal immigrant wreaks havoc through a lawful, peaceful city. In part because, you know, gotta shift that perspective a bit.
Yes, I love
Yeah.
it. That's fantastic.
Yeah, mine isn't so dire, so mine's probably more like fat kid tries to win the love of his athletic father.
Very nice, very nice.
That didn't help me at all.
Like, we bought you
So-
time.
I know you bought me when the only thing that when you said Weekly World News, like that, like really got me. It's like Joel Christian Gill's pulling the race card again. So like that's pretty much what all my books are about. So I think that's the best way to talk about it.
Yeah, that is good. All right. So this some of these questions that I'll have is specific to the different works that you are all working on, but this one is for everyone. What was the hardest scene to write and or illustrate in your upcoming work?
It's a good question.
All right, so we'll start with Stan.
Oh, hello. All right. So to give a little context, The Hazards of Love is the story of Amparo, a queer Latinx teen who makes some mistakes and takes a deal from a talking cat. They did not read the fine print of this. The cat steals their name and identity and shoves Amparo into a surreal world where monsters feed on memories and literal flesh. So Amparo is using their wits and intelligence and empathy to survive and figure out how to escape without turning into a monster themselves. And that means that at some point they find themselves living with a sadistic monster who is gaslighting them into thinking they're a very bad person. And he's very good at being convincing. And there are several parts where they doubt themselves because of it. And I, the author, know this is because said sadistic monster is excellent at manipulation. But it's the sort of thing that teens of color deal with all the time. And one of the reasons I wrote this graphic novel, because so often any small mistake, any imperfection on the part of someone who happens to be part of a marginalized identity and a teenager is treated like they are. I keep thinking of ages ago when there was a quote like super predators, and it was referring to a 15-year-old. And it is the sort of thing where white men in their late 30s or early 30s will get called boys being boys for stealing a car on a joyride. But then a teenager of color who does that, it ends less cheerfully. And so this is a very delicate line to walk in a fantasy story, right? So that was challenging to write. And I hope I got it across so that anyone who reads it can see that, you know, the monster's lying about this kid who's just a kid. And more importantly, that they won't think if he's right about the main character, then he's right about me.
that's very powerful.
Sorry, I went hard for the first
No,
one.
do not apologize for your honesty and your great answers. That's fabulous. Joel, we'll go with you next. What was the hardest thing, or what has been the hardest thing in your adaptation? Or if you want to talk with some of the other stories you've written as well.
Well, I mean, so Stamped is about ideas, right? It's the definitive history of racist ideas in America. And so, it's trying to illustrate like things that are not concrete. How do you illustrate like pernicious racism for 600 years? Like, how do you illustrate that, right? Some of the things that I've chosen to do, and I do a lot in a lot of my books, is try to use symbols to represent things. So, for example, in Stamped, whenever there is an idea that is racist that actually continues throughout the entire book, like these ideas sort of like they're put in a place. They start at a specific point, but then they sort of move out throughout the rest of history, American history. And so I put them in like black dripping word balloons so that those are always separated out, so that when you see that, you automatically know that that is a racist idea that will continue. And I also have always tried to use symbols in that way. For example, in a lot of in my most recent book, Fights, which is my memoir, I talk like the difference between using Black people using the N-word versus white people using the N-word. And in Fights, when Black people use the N-word, it's just the word. It's just the word. But when white people use it, it's a racist caricature of a Black person, because I wanted to make the distinction between what the difference between white people saying it and what Black people were saying it. Because when Black people said it, it was just a word. But when white people were saying it, it was embedded with all of that racial history and that sort of implied violence that actually happens. And so with Stamped, like drawing Cotton Mather, William Lloyd Garrison, W.E.B. Du Bois, Angela Davis, and Thomas Jefferson over and over and over again, and making, like there are places where I make them like funny, but also saying racist stuff, right? So it's like, how do you, like this, like trying to make that distinction has always been really difficult, because you want to make stuff, you want to make sure that people understand the weight of what's happening here, but also you want people to want what the ideas to stick with people as they move throughout the book. So I think just the entire book is a 572 page tome of history, and I'm turning it into 250 page graphic novel. So the hardest thing about it is all of it.
That would be. All right, Lilah, what about you? What was the hardest thing to draw or to get in your book? You are muted.
The little thing said, "Oh, you're muted." Sorry, I was trying to have a little snack because we've been snowed in, and I just went out and was able to get some food, so I apologize. I know I shouldn't be eating on a panel.
How dare you see to your bodily needs?
I know, I was like trying to be like a little mouse, just eating a little beef jerky while no one was like, I apologize. Girl Haven is a story about a kid named Ash who has been assigned male at birth and has always identified as a boy, who, along with some friends, ends up in this magical kingdom called Curators that is just for girls, and no boys are allowed there. And of course, the question that arises, well, what is Ash doing there? And Ash, we come to find out very quickly, has had some questions about what does it mean to be a boy, has never felt comfortable as a boy, and has been questioning this whole aspect of Ash's life. And so there are a couple of key scenes in the book where Ash is talking to Eleanor, who's another one of the main characters. And they have a really nice rapport, these two characters. And Ash is sort of pouring out their feelings about gender and about, the confusion of not knowing, of not understanding, who am I, where do I fit in? How do I want people to see me? How do I see me? All these questions that we don't expect typically to have to answer when we're 12 years old. These are huge questions, questions about gender that so many people take for granted. And when you find yourself as a young person not being able to take those questions for granted and not knowing the answers, it's really unsettling and really scary. And so writing those scenes, especially where Ash is just unloading all these feelings of confusion, was really emotional for me because I was drawing on something very, very personal. And I was, you know, I'm a transgender woman. I transitioned 4 years and change ago. And, you know, it's very, very recently to me that these feelings were feelings that I didn't dare share with anyone. And here I am now just sharing them with the whole world. Just like, here, look at the inside of my brain. Here's all my feelings, blah. And that's frightening. And to do those feelings justice, you really have to get in there and, you know, get real with them. It's scary. And, but I really wanted those themes to be real because I wanted someone who was like me and who was a young person to have this book and find it and relate to Ash and say, oh, I see myself in Ash. I get this. Ash's feelings are my feelings, and feel not alone. And because I always felt alone, and people shouldn't have to feel that way.
Yeah, no, I don't know how much I've heard from some of the other creators that going on Goodreads is a terrible place to go and see what other people are talking about, but I've scrolled through like everyone's. And Lilah, those scenes with Ash and Eleanor are repeatedly on Goodreads, people pulling out as some of the best scenes in the entire story. So
Nice.
you did amazing work with the just so real and so raw of those two characters and their interactions. So thank you for pouring your heart onto the page, literally.
Well, thank you, because I wouldn't go on Goodreads on a dare, but
No,
I appreciate you doing it for me.
Yeah, it can be a really great place and also horrible. So all right, Yehudi, so what was the hardest part? So, and especially with Chunky, it's semi-autobiographical. I mean, I don't know if you actually had a real imaginary cheerleader like cheering you on with everything, but there's much of the story that is your own story. Yehudi's struggle with his health and everything, and so you did, again, like Lilah, put a lot of your heart into the pages. So what was some of the difficulty in writing your story?
Yeah, definitely having it be a memoir, you know, was totally different than anything I had written before. Like everything I wrote before was, you know, sci-fi, action, adventure, comedy. You know, the stakes are, you know, robots blowing up planets and, you know, larger than life, huge. And so the first struggle was like, yeah, how do I, you know, what are the stakes of like a smaller story, like a more human story? Like, how can I still have my sort of like comedic pacing, but still deal with these like, you know, real life issues? And so, yeah, that was initially the hardest thing. Just like, yeah, structure. Like, how do I make like, okay, the story of this fat kid, me, trying out for different sports and failing at all of them, like how to make that sort of like a cohesive narrative was sort of like the initial struggle. But it was interesting. So like, you know, first draft, you know, I made myself the monster character, and then there was no human Hootie. And then actually, I think it was Raina, I was having dinner with Raina Telgemeier, who's like, you know, the queen of the memoirs. And she's telling me like, no, make it about you. Like, this is your story. Like, so she really helped me to sort of like not hide behind the sort of sci-fi fantastical machinations, but then, you know, really make it about myself. You know, my sisters are named what their names are. My parents are what their names are. And yeah, making it as honest, as real as possible, but then adding in my sort of like comedic twist of like having this sort of imaginary friend who's like a mascot, who's really basically a proxy for my inner voice. You know, it's like, you know, as I'm failing and feeling terrible about, you know, failing at all these sports, you know, inside I'm thinking like, you know, I shouldn't be made to feel like a failure in this avenue. Just because I'm terrible at baseball and soccer and swimming doesn't mean I'm worthless. And like, you know, you know, so it's about that journey of sort of like recognizing like, oh, I can draw, I'm funny. Like, what if that's the thing I start to focus on? But there's not really like, you know, especially when I grew up, there weren't trophies for that stuff. There wasn't like, you know, I grew up in Houston, Texas, you know, Texas football is like, that's the religion. So it's like,
Yep.
so like, you know, the thing that, you know, that I sort of like thought of by the end was like, oh, this is about a kid who is learning how to win without losing who he is. So like that sort of like, it came like as I was wrapping up the project, I was like, oh, that's what it was. Like, I wish I would have known that at the beginning of the project. That would have saved me a lot of time. But it was sort of like the journey of it all, like helped me solidify what it was.
Isn't that fun when a creative project teaches you something that you didn't
Yeah.
realize was there at the beginning?
Yeah.
You're like, oh,
Yeah.
great.
And what's interesting on that
achieved.
is I watched the behind the scenes making of the movie Roma, like the Netflix movie Roma. And Cuarón was talking about like, he just wanted vignettes of his childhood. And then by the end, you know, then he was sort of hoping it would like come together at the end. And I was watching that. I was like, yeah, that's kind of what I did with Chunky. Just sort of like take these vignettes of like, oh, here's me trying out for baseball. And hey, I only got on base when I'd get hit by the baseball. Like that was the only way I'd ever get on base. And then just thinking about like stories from childhood of like, yeah, I look back at photos and I was like, I wasn't that huge as a kid, but I was a fat kid, like, you know, but like I just did not fit in the little boy clothes that were made for everybody. And sort of reconciling that. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you. So this question is for Lilah, Yehudi, and Stan. So you have really inserted your own personal stories into these pages, as you have mentioned already. But I'm kind of curious what went into the decision to make it so personal, and is there a certain amount of courage that is necessary to put so much of yourself into that story? So let's start with Lilah. You kind of talked a little bit about why you wanted to make it so personal, but maybe speak more to the courage that you had there.
I did. You know, I've said this before, and I often start to cry when I do it. So I'm going to try to get, but I have been lucky enough to write on the Lumberjanes series. I wrote the Lumberjanes original graphic novels. And there's this character in Lumberjanes called Jo, who is a trans girl. And Jo's a wonderful, absolutely wonderful character, and very well written. And they consulted with a trans woman when they were writing the book, writing the scenes where she comes out as trans, and it's all beautifully well done. But no one who was writing the book was a trans woman, and you know, couldn't really write about that experience. And I remember I was on a panel at San Diego Comic-Con, and I was talking about this, and I was like, just the idea that if there had been a character like that when I was in middle school, it would have changed everything for me, because I could have seen Jo and thought, well, it's okay. Like, I'm not weird. I'm not, you know, like who I am doesn't need to be a secret, because this is who this girl is, and she's got friends, people love her. And so I wanted to write basically the book that I desperately wished that I had had when I was in middle school. I mean, that was exactly what I set out to do. And the book it's for middle schoolers. And like, I like that adults are reading it and enjoying it. I think that's like cool, but I really don't care that much. Like, I really just want like 11 and 12-year-olds to be reading this book and feeling not alone. So I mean, yeah, it takes a little bit of courage, like I was saying, to get that stuff out and to have those conversations with yourself on the page. But at the same time, it's kind of a no-brainer for me. Like, I had this idea for a story, and someone wants to publish it. Of course, I'm going to do it. You know, like, how could I not?
Yep. All right, Stanley, or Stan, sorry, we both have done this now. Both moderators calling you by your last names.
Stan is short for Stanley. It is, quite frankly, a ridiculous name to write under, but I love it. I also go by it in real life. So it's not fully, but it's part of my actual name. So
okay,
fine, don't worry. So I actually have kind of, for this, the opposite approach of Yehudi in it. So for this particular story, I used my personal experiences kind of like a vase in a mosaic. Yes, you take a vase, you smash it to pieces, the pieces go into your mosaic, and at the end of that, you've made a picture. And if you did the mosaic thing appropriately, people can no longer see a vase. They might think these pieces may have come from a vase, but unless you saw the vase beforehand, you don't necessarily know for sure what the vase was shaped like, or I don't know if this is a good metaphor or not. But it conveys the idea of what I tell myself, so I won't feel too naked in parts of the work or too vulnerable. And also so that it is less about me in this sense. There are pieces of me in it. There are pieces of the people I love. But overall, it is a call for the reader to feel less alone. Hello, weird, queer, Latina kid. I'm here. I'm also weird and queer. And here's a story for you about someone like you who gets to go on an adventure. And things are terrible, but then they work out. And when I was a kid, that was all I wanted, right? I wanted adventure stories with people like me. And I won't, we could do like an entire panel on intersectionality, so I won't dwell on it too much. But I will say that I was always so frustrated because I would either get one or the other. I was either allowed to be Latina or I was allowed to be queer, and the two would not intersect. And that's if they ever came up. So this story has so much of my life and so much of my loved ones and the people I admire and surround myself with, because it is important in my heart for any lonely queer teen out there to be able to see themselves in this, right?
absolutely. All right, Yehudi, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, talk about intersectionality. Like I'm a, growing up, I was a lower middle class Mexican Jew growing up in suburbs of Houston. Like, so I definitely did not see any representation anywhere like that spoke to like my upbringing. But I actually, courage, the flip side of that also is it's kind of exciting being able to like create this stuff that's not out there. Like, I'd like to flip that around and it'd be like if you're just a straight cis white male, like it takes more courage to try to come up with a story because there's like millions that have already been beaten to a like to a pulp, like beating a dead horse. Like that takes courage, like to say like, oh, I got a story. Like, haven't we heard a million of them? Like, so I feel like for us, like it feels like there is nothing out there that is like what I'm putting out. So like it's kind of exciting, like being able to like have a wide open space to be able to like have the stories I'm putting out. Like it just feels like there's nothing else out there like that. So it's exciting. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm going to put Joel on the spot. I didn't originally include you on this question because you're talking about Stamped, but fights is your life. So what went into the decision for you putting that on the page and the courage it took to do that?
I mean, well, originally I started drawing when I first started drawing comics, I wanted to draw my story, and then that failed tremendously, like just it's the colossal failure. So I started drawing comics about Black history because those stories were already set up. Like it was, you know, start, middle, and finish. I had a character, I had like a spark, a narrative arc, everything that worked out in its wake. And so after doing a number of those comics, I went back to the idea of telling my own story. And it's funny, you bring up Raina Telgemeier, because it was actually a combination of Raina Telgemeier's smile and Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me that made me write Fights. Because a friend of mine describes Fights as like, it's kind of like Smile, only with violence and the N-word. And they said, if you could get Raina to write it.
On cover?
Yeah,
Somebody
that needs
said
to
if
be
you-
on the jacket.
Yeah.
Yeah, like if you could get Raina to write a blurb for you that says it's like Smile with violence and the N-word, that would be great.
Yeah.
Because it was about like, I had read Smile, and then I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, and Coates is about the same age I am, and we're from a similar area of the country. He's from like Baltimore, I'm from Southwestern Virginia, so like a lot of the words are the same, and a lot of the things that he talked about were the same. And when he described, one thing that struck me really, really closely in that was he described not going to parties or not going to places because if you didn't have enough people there to back you up in case something popped off, right? And that was like a constant thing that I thought of. It was not even something that it like even registered to me, like, oh yeah, like I was always afraid of being killed or being jumped, and like how I was constantly in this place where I was like, I had to protect my body. And then I had this conversation with my son. My son is 18, but he was 13 at the time. And I said, he told me there was a fight at his school. And like I said, I live in White Condo. I live on 3 acres of land. I have a pool. Like the police don't come to my house, right? Because they're just like no police here, right? Because we live in a pretty affluent area. And I was shocked. I'm like, there's never fights there. And he was like, I was like, have you ever been in a fight? Just like randomly, like, I don't think I've ever seen you in a fight. He was like, no. And so I went through this whole process of thinking, I need to teach this kid how to fight. What if he gets into a fight? How does he protect himself? And then in that same moment, I went through every single fight that I'd ever gotten into. And from the time that I was like 5 years old until I was 20, the last time I got into a fight. And there was like hundreds of fights. I've probably forgotten more fights than some people have gotten into. And then I thought to myself, I worked damn hard for him not to have to worry about that. And so in the same breath, I'm like, have you ever been in a fight? He goes, no. And I turned to him and I'm like, you know what? Don't worry about it. You don't have to fight. Like, you just live your life. You just do it. And he's just like, good talk, Dad. And at that point, it dawned on me that a lot of people don't know what it's like to live a life like I lived. And so when you think about children's literature, when you think about literature in general, specifically YA or anything, it's like you're making either a mirror or a window, right? And so it's a mirror for people who actually lived the life like I lived. It's like, you are not alone. This is a place, that you are special, but your problems are not. And other people have gone through that, and there is wisdom out there in the world, and there are choices that you can make. And it's a window for people who like look at that and go, oh my God, I didn't know that that's what's happening. Those kids are not just sociopaths or psychopaths. They had actually gone through a whole load of crap before they got to school that day. Like, they've gone through more stuff in the morning before, between waking up and getting to school, than most people go through their entire lives. And so then you wonder why they're acting out at the breakfast table or acting out at the lunch table. And so, like, because children don't know how to do that. So I made this book specifically, Fights as a love letter to kids who grew up like I did. And it's to show them that they are special, but their problems aren't, and there are other people who have been through those things. It's like, somebody said to me on Twitter, I can't remember who said it, but somebody was like, fights should encourage people to be the adult you needed as a kid. And that's what I try to do with Fights.
Wow, that's some Twitter wisdom there. That's awesome. So several of you have worked in other people's universes, or you're adapting books that were not your original works. So I am curious, what are some of the challenges of creating graphic novels in worlds that are the works of others? And how much do you get, or how much does the original creator get to influence what's happening now with yours? So we'll start with Lilah.
So the story I like to tell about this, I wrote a Doctor Who comic once, and I've been a Doctor Who fan since I was 11 years old. And I know a lot about Doctor Who. And it was this, it was a story about the 11th Doctor, the Matt Smith Doctor. And so I have a scene where at one point the Doctor checks his watch, and he's got his watch on like this, like facing the back of his wrist. And he says some, cute little quote. And the BBC, like, they read this script and they came back and they're like, well, the Doctor doesn't check his watch like that. And I was like, well, actually he does. And so it's this episode, this time code, go look, you'll see it's there. And I never heard back from them again. Like, I never heard another word from them again. I think they were like, okay, she's a problem, just leave her be. It's funny doing that. I've written a bunch of superhero comics. I've written other sort of like licensed things over my course of my career. And I think the key to it is always kind of knowing how much you can get away with, right? How much can you get away with before they start to get mad? And I've always tried to walk that line as close as possible. So like, how far can I push this while still remaining true to whatever the thing is, which like with Lumberjanes is very, very cute and fun and sweet. So you want to stay true to that. But then you also want to put your own stamp on it. So there's this constant tension between like you as an artist, creator, and you as a person who's been hired to do a job. And so that exists, but mostly, I've been lucky enough to only write things that were other people's creations that I really enjoyed. So it was just like getting to go over to someone else's house and play with their toys, honestly. Like, that's pretty much my whole job. So I don't complain that much about it.
I love that analogy, getting to play with someone else's toys. That's great. All right. How about Joel? How about for you in adapting Stamped?
It's really, it's not a work for hire. So it's really a collaboration. Abram gave me a list of like an entire copy of the book with highlighted notes, like here's some things to think about and some things to consider and some important ideas to hit on. And then the rest of it is me basically just trying to make things interesting and giving it its own character. So, when Abram wrote Thomas Jefferson's whole biography and Stamped and how he was like one of America's foremost intellectuals, he didn't have to think about what pants Thomas Jefferson was wearing. I did, right? So I have to think about what kind of pants he's wearing, like what his shoes look like. I have to think about any person that he mentions. I have to think about what they look like, and then like recreate them over and over and over again, which is something that, I don't think people have to think about. And so I actually have to think about how these people interact, because he doesn't write very much dialogue, right? But I have dialogue all throughout the book so far, right? And so it's interesting because these are historical people. So some of these people I've done work on before, but for the most part, it's really just conveying his ideas, making sure that his ideas are hit. I'm making sure that I hit those ideas so that I'm basically trying to beat people over the head with these ideas. Mostly because I believe that racism in America is like the original sin, and not so much the original sin like, oh, we did this bad thing. It's like racism is the original sin. That it's like alcoholism. America has a problem with racism like alcoholics have a problem with alcoholism. You can never fix it if you do not stand up and say, I have a problem. You can't even start it, right? And so like part of the problem is like looking at the ideas in this book and how those ideas have permeated, like the fact that, you guys have probably heard this, doctors are killing Black women like police are killing Black men, right? And that is a 500-year-old idea that Black people don't have the same nerve receptors, or we have thicker skin, or there are specific diseases that affect Black people more. That stuff came from like the justifications of the transatlantic slave trade. That all came from that, right? And it's the kind of thing that like these little ideas that are just like that permeate, that are just maddening to think. Like, I'll just give you one really good example. In the early part of the 20th century, there was an opioid epidemic, right? And it was killing housewives in America, right? Because doctors were prescribing morphine to women. It did not hit Black people. Why did it not hit Black people? Because doctors don't prescribe pain medicine to the same degree that they hit Black people. So the opioid crisis that happens right now is not affecting Black people the same way. because of the exact same thing. Doctors are not prescribing pain medicine. And so like, until we stand up, so when you look at Stamped, and what my whole idea is that comics are a sneaky way to teach people stuff. So when you read Stamped and you see that, I'm trying to hammer people over the head with these ideas so that when they see them, at some point we'll all stand together. And you know what? We have a problem. We can stand up and fix it, because one of the things that I think people miss all the time is like, racist is not an insult, it's a description, and you can fix it, right? You can absolutely fix it. Sorry, I've like got on a soapbox and talked for 20 minutes, but I'm a professor. Nobody's ever accused me of not being able to talk.
This is your panel too, so you get to talk as long as well, until time runs out. So we had a question come in through the Q&A, and I'm kind of going to pose it for everybody here. Specifically wondering how your families have reacted to your works, especially some of the more personal ones. But if we've got like a strong reaction to some other book that wasn't your life as well, you can definitely share that. And let's start with Stan.
What a question. So it's hard to get into this without being like, let me tell you my entire history. As mentioned, I grew up in Mexico, and now I am in the US. Throughout this, there have been certain expectations of me and what I am capable of from my family. Being a cartoonist, it may surprise you, was not one of them. Neither was doing something I liked. It was like, yes, you are smart enough for college in the US. Okay, you will continue being smart enough. You will become a doctor or a lawyer. Choose your favorite. I ended up so bad at both that I went into science for a while. And I mean, got as far as doing my PhD, but was miserable. And then the way life works, through a roundabout of really weird coincidences and even weirder jobs. For a while, I was the curator of a store that sold dead things. And I ended up being able to do what I've always been doing when I was supposed to be doing science. It's my joke, right? I'd have my centrifuge running and I'd be drawing a comic, even if no one else was going to see it at the time. And now I am getting to actually do comics full time, which is a shocker to me and completely incomprehensible to my family. I wish I could tell you something like they've been supportive or they've always been proud of me. And it's not that that's not true, but they are very perplexed as to how this has worked out for me. And yeah, they just don't really understand the appeal of why someone would want to make a comic, and more so why someone would want to read a comic. It just doesn't seem to occur, unfortunately. So sorry for being a downer. I will say that like my in-laws are very excited about the comic. And, you know, I love my family and they are supportive in other ways.
Yeah, that's definitely a true testament. I see that often in the families that of the students that I have, that they support their interests to a point, and they're like, but can you really make money doing that?
It can be your hobby, is what they always said.
Right, go get a real job and then you can do that on the side. So I definitely see that a lot. And yeah.
They are very much my family too. I just saw someone pop that up in the chat, and no, I mean, yes. They are definitely they get a thank you in the intro to my book for a reason, and that's because they are very close to me and I love them very much. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. Go on. All right. Yehudi, how about you? How did your family react to your stories?
Yeah, my parents had an interesting reaction. Like I sent it to them for them to read, and then they called me and they were very like careful with their words. And they were like, were we really that pushy? And I was like, no, it's not that you were pushy. It's that this is, you know, and this is something actually I talked with Raina about, like, because your memoir is like, it's more about how it felt as a kid. So things are heightened. So like, you know, uh, uh, so I had to tell him like, no, it's not that you specifically said, no, you got to do this sport or else you're out, you know, like, but it's how I felt. Like, it's definitely like the pressure parents put on their kids. Like, that's how I felt. And they just, it's funny because they kept going on about like, well, just tell everybody we weren't that pushy. Just tell everyone we weren't that pushy. And I'm like, you're literally you're pushing me to tell other people that you weren't that pushy. Okay, got it.
That's great.
Yeah. And then they got the joke and they were fine after that.
Awesome. Lilah, how does your family react to some of the stories that you've put out there?
It's funny. My parents don't read my books. My parents are very well-intentioned people. I think they just think, well, comic books are just not for us. You know, I think that's what they would say. Like my mom would say, well, I think it's lovely that you write books, but I don't understand them. What's funny is that my kids, they're teenage girls, and which is fantastic because I have access to all of the current memes and slang and everything. So I'm never like left behind, which is great because I write a lot of stuff for kids. And but they are completely unimpressed by me, my kids. So they don't look at, like, they couldn't care less about my books. And my older daughter is irritated because her friends all think I'm really cool. And she's like, no, she's like, my mom is not cool. Like, don't say that. She's boring. She's like any other mom. They're like, no, she's cool. She writes books. You know, no, she's not. Stop it.
That's awesome. Kids tend to downplay their kids or their parents anyway. My dad used to help out a lot at our school, and they're like, yeah, your dad's pretty funny. And I'm like, no, he's not. Don't encourage him. It'll just get worse. Joel, how about we'll give you the final word on this. This is our last portion of the panel here.
Well, I feel you. My kids are the same way. Like, I was on TV recently and I was like, so I'm on TV again. And like, it just didn't even blip. It was like not even a blip. They were just like, yeah. Like, didn't even care. So my son is like, you know, like an average common, like, stereotypical teenage boy. He was like, cool story, bro. Like, that's legitimately how he said it. And I have 3 daughters. And my 2 older daughters are twins. They both read it and were like, you know, crying and I love you. My mom read it and was like, you know, it was a really good story. I wish I had protected you more, is what she said to me. My siblings are like various degrees of like, I like it, I don't like it, but not like I don't like it, you shouldn't have done it. Like, I just don't like having read it. You know what I mean? Like, seeing what you've gone through. And my middle daughter was away at, she was at study abroad in Spain when Fights came out, when I got the copy. So she hadn't read it. And so she read, like, I'd given her the PDF a long time ago. So finally, like around December, maybe like early December before Fights came out, she got around to reading it. And she called me, even with the time difference, she called me and I couldn't answer because I was in class. And so she just sent me like a bunch of Snapchat like stories. And the Snapchat story was like her crying. It was just like her, no, it was just like her like face. It was like normal. And you could tell she had been crying. And she was like, I finally got around to reading your stupid book. Right. And then then the next one, I flipped over the next one and her face was all crunched up. And she's like, I'm fine. It's okay. And then the last one was, I shouldn't have read it before I went to class. So, you know, like that was pretty much how they all responded. I don't expect extended family to have read it. I think some of my aunts on my dad's side have read it. And mostly it's been pretty positive. I mean, I'm dealing with stuff that people don't really talk, like specifically Black men that are 6 feet tall and look like me talk about, which is, you know, sexual abuse and trauma and being vulnerable and those things. And so it's a really uncomfortable thing for a lot of people to sort of discuss, but I still just think I think it's really important just to normalize it, not like normalize it in like, oh, this is normal, but normalize the people that this happened to. And I think that's a really important, it's kind of like Lilah said, like if I had seen a book like Fights when I was like 12, it would have made a difference in my life because I would have seen somebody who had gone through something like I did. And the language is really, like I use the language exactly the way like I learned language, like the cursing and everything else. So it's pretty, it can be pretty vulgar at times, but it's really just like the kids that are going through this stuff hear this all the time. So this is not new to them. It's like the way of life for them. So, you know, I think it's, I think everybody that's read Fights, it's been positive for everybody. So that's been really good.
That's awesome. And I do appreciate that. I mean, there is quite a bit of vulgarity, but I say that to teachers as well, especially when they're like, well, there's too many cuss words in here. And you know, they go outside and they're doing the exact same thing, you know, like, so just because it's not on the page doesn't mean it's not happening.
Yeah. And I think that the kids that, you know, kids that grow up in the way that I grew up, like, that's where you learn it. Like you learn, I mean, there was no, like, I didn't learn the F word from a book. Like it just didn't happen. I learned it from like an uncle, right? Like, you know, or my mom said it. Like, I think that people, I don't know why people walk around like children are these delicate little things, but like kids in the projects and kids who grew up like I did are not delicate. They have already seen some stuff that would make your eyes peel. And I think that that's a thing you need to understand about these kids. So I think that's an important thing. I think it's the important part of the window, like look in and see what's happening.
Definitely, definitely. I want to thank you all for being here, especially since all of you were also on another panel earlier, and I selfishly made you be on this one as well. So thank you so much for your books, and looking forward to the things that are coming out or had just been released. And definitely follow these wonderful people on Twitter. I put their handles in there. You'll get all kinds of cool things about what they're working on. And thank you so much for sharing with us and being here tonight.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you all.
Yeah,
Nice
it was
to
an
meet you
honor
all.
to be with you
Likewise.
guys.
And thank you to all the attendees for coming to see the panel. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you all.